Good day. This is the recorded lecture for week 5, scheduled for week 5. It covers Chapter 8, Environmental Health and Toxicology. Your book opens with a case study, as usual, and this particular one is about BPA. What is BPA? In particular, BPA is found in polycarbonate plastics and epoxy resins. BPA actually stands for bisphenol A. Polycarbonate plastics are often used in containers that store food, beverages, such as water bottles, and baby bottles and cups. They may also be used in toys and other consumer goods. Epoxy resins can be used to coat the inside of metal projects such as food cans, baby formula cans, bottle tops, and water supply lines. These days, traces of BPA are found in humans nearly everywhere. In one study of several thousand normal adult Americans, 95% had measurable amounts of this chemical in their bodies. The most likely source of contamination is from food and beverage containers. During plastic polymerization, not all BPA gets locked up into the chemical bonds that are formed. So unbound molecules can leach out, especially when the plastic is heated, washed, or harsh ingredients like detergents are used, or it's scratched, or exposed to acidic compounds like tomato juice, vinegar, or soft drinks. Epidemiological studies in humans show that there's a correlation between urine concentrations of BPA and cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and liver enzyme abnormalities. These are some of the same conditions associated with our industrialized countries. Many products are now available that have BPA-free markings on them, as you can see from this photo on the slide. So you may want to look for that. But here are a number of ways you can reduce your exposure to BPA. Use BPA-free plastic or glass baby bottles. Do not microwave plastic food containers that have BPA in them. Avoid containers that are marked with the number 7 recycling stamp. Limit your consumption of canned foods because the resin containing BPA lines many metal food cans. Store and cook hot liquids and foods in porcelain, glass, or stainless steel containers or plastics that are marked BPA-free. So this case study kind of gives an example of some of the types of questions we're going to explore in this chapter. We're going to, in terms of human exposure to environmental toxins. So how dangerous are low-level but widespread exposures to a variety of environmental toxins, BPA being one example? What are the effects of these chemicals? BPA in particular is an endocrine system compound that affects endocrine systems. And how do we test and evaluate for toxic substances? Here's another little case that I introduced here. It's the case of MBTE. MBTE stands for methyl tertiary butyl ether. And it was added to gasoline to prevent knocking and reduce air pollution problems in California. Because it is soluble in water, it started showing up in groundwater supplies. So in 1999, so this is quite a few years ago now, MTBE was banned from gasoline. So all the gasoline had to be reformulated to remove that substance. So this is an example of a good idea, maybe, to help air pollution, an air pollution solution, causing a water pollution problem and a potential health problem that was unanticipated. As far as we know today, effects of MTBE are inconclusive, but it is a known carcinogen in high doses. So before we get started on some of these issues, what is health? The World Health Organization defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. By that definition, we are all ill to some extent. But likewise, we can improve our health to live happier, longer, more productive, and more satisfying lives if we think about what we do. The next question is, what is disease? A disease is an abnormal change in the body's condition that impairs important physical or psychological functions. Diet and nutrition, infectious agents, toxic substances, genetics, trauma, and stress all play roles in morbidity, which is defined as illness, and mortality, which is defined as death. Environmental health focuses on external factors that cause disease, including elements of the natural, social, cultural, and technological worlds that we live in. This figure in your book, figure 8.2, sort of concisely graphs the major sources of environmental health risks. So you may want to look at those, and then we kind of follow this organization throughout the chapter. We cover most of these issues. Generally, I think it's prudent, without going crazy and getting paranoid about it, to avoid, these various risk factors or sources of risk. So your chapter walks through these different environmental health risks: infectious diseases, toxins, radiation, pollution, and trauma. So we'll take each of these in order. So the first discussion is on infectious disease. So we'll begin there. Infectious diseases require a susceptible host, a disease agent, and an environment for that agent to survive. So infectious diseases are about things that you can catch. If any one of these factors is not present, the disease will not occur. So treatments and avoidance of risk involves disrupting this triangle shown here in some fashion. The good news is that the global disease burden is changing. We've made huge advances in conquering some nasty infectious diseases such as smallpox, polio, typhoid fever, cholera, yellow fever, and even AIDS we have treatments for, although you'll see that AIDS comes up periodically in various chapters because of areas where it's still persistent, where these treatments are not available. We're also living longer. World life expectancies have doubled in the 20th century. And generally, we're having declining child mortality. In 1950, for example, 220 children per 1,000 died before the age of 5. In the year 2000, only 86 children die per 1,000. So we're making progress here. Child mortality in particular has fallen dramatically over the past 50 years, and child mortality is expected to continue to decline in the future. Note that South Central Asia saw a significant improvement in child survival in the 1970s and 1980s, while Sub-Saharan Africa still lags behind, mainly because of various strife and mortalities due to wars and conflict, and also AIDS. Table 8.1 in your book ranks the leading causes of the global disease burden. So that's the disease burden imposed on all of us worldwide. And it compares 1990 to the year 2020. The World Health Organization predicts that in 2020, heart disease, which was fifth in the list of causes of global disease burden a decade ago, will be the leading source of disability and deaths worldwide. Most of that increase will be in the poorer parts of the world, where people are rapidly adopting the lifestyles and diet of richer countries. Similarly, global cancer rates will increase by 50%. It's expected that by 2020, 15 million people will have cancer and 9 million people will die from it. Although the traditional killers in developing countries, like infections, maternal and perinatal birth complications, and nutritional deficiencies, still take a terrible toll, diseases such as depression and heart attacks that once were thought to occur only in rich countries are rapidly becoming the leading causes of disability and premature death everywhere. A silent epidemic of diabetes is now sweeping through our population. It's estimated that 1/3 of all children born today in North America will develop this disease in their lifetime. Obesity, diets high in sugar and fat, lack of exercise, and poverty, which actually encourages fast food intake and makes health food less available, all play important roles in this disease. Diarrhea, which was the second leading cause of disease burden in 1990, is expected to be ninth on the list in 2020, while measles and malaria are expected to drop out of the top 15 causes of disability altogether. Tuberculosis, which is becoming resistant to antibiotics and is spreading rapidly in many areas, especially the former Soviet Union, is the only infectious disease whose ranking is not expected to change over the next 20 years. Traffic accidents are also soaring as more people drive. War, violence, and self-inflicted injuries similarly are becoming much more important health risks than ever before. Antibiotic resistance is a phenomenon that we also have to be concerned about. Malaria, the most deadly of all insect-borne illnesses, is an example of the return of a disease that once was thought to be nearly eliminated. Malaria now claims about 1 million lives every year, and 90% are in Africa, and most of them are children. With the advent of modern medicines and pesticides, malaria had nearly been wiped out in many places, but recently it has come roaring back. The protozoan parasite that causes the disease is now resistant to many drugs, while the mosquitoes that transmit it have developed resistance to many insecticides. In recent years, health workers have become increasingly alarmed about the rapid spread of methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, or MRSA. Staphylococcus, or staph, is very common. Most people have at least some of these bacteria in them. They are a common cause of sore throats and skin infections, but are usually easily controlled. This new strain is resistant to penicillin and related antibiotics and can cause deadly infections, especially in people with weak immune systems. MRSA is most frequent in hospitals, nursing homes, correctional facilities, and other places where people are in close contact. It is generally spread through direct skin contact. School locker rooms, gymnasiums, and contact sports are also sources of infections. Another example is extensively drug-resistant tuberculosis. It's a form of tuberculosis, and we mentioned it in the previous slide, caused by bacteria that are resistant to some of the most effective anti-TB drugs. Tuberculosis, which is becoming resistant to these antibiotics, is spreading rapidly. So some examples of this are important. As far as your own personal use goes, you should try to minimize unnecessary use of antibiotics. Don't risk your health. If you have an infection, you need to get treated by it. But take the full dose, all the pills in the bottle, even if you feel better. Don't dispose of expired antibiotics or any other medication in the toilet or sink. Take them to the nearest police station where there's a depository there for them. This is a scheme on how antibiotic resistance occurs. Basically, random mutations make a few cells resistant. When challenged by antibiotics, only those cells survive, and they give rise to a resistant colony. Also, sexual reproduction in prokaryotes, we call that conjugation, or plasmid transfer moves genes from one strain or species to another. Toxicology, which is our next subject, is the study of toxins or poisons and their effects, particularly on living systems. Because many substances are known to be poisonous to life, whether it's plant, animal, or microbial, toxicology is a broad field, drawing from biochemistry, histology, pharmacology, pathology, and many other disciplines. Toxins damage or kill living organisms because they react with the cellular components to disrupt metabolic functions. Because of this reactivity, toxins often are harmful even in extremely dilute concentrations. Toxins have different effects, and I'm going to go quickly through this series of slides. You can go through your book and look at these terms more thoroughly, so you may want to review this material. But toxins can be allergens, that is, substances that activate the immune system. In this case, they function as antigens that are substances that are recognized as foreign by white blood cells, and they stimulate the production of specific antibodies. They can be immune system depressants, so they're pollutants that in some different ways depress the entire immune system. They can also be endocrine disruptors, which means that they disrupt normal hormone functions. Environmental estrogens, like BPA that we discussed, have been particularly problematic because they cause reproductive problems in animals, even at very low doses. Neurotoxins are metabolic poisons that specifically attack nerve cells. Generally, these are more toxic, and they can be very fast-acting. Mutagens are agents that damage or alter genetic material, so these can lead to birth defects or development of tumors. Teratogens specifically cause abnormalities during embryonic growth and development. And finally, carcinogens are substances that cause cancer. This figure in your book depicts sources of toxins, particularly in the home. We tend to worry about stories of environmental contamination, but you're more at risk of exposure in your home. Also, there's a section on page 163 of your book that gives you some tips on what you can do. This is a list of individual health practices that minimize your exposure to things that can hurt your health. It is probably better to follow this list than get overly worried about some of the continuing news stories about environmental contamination. There are many sources of toxic and hazardous chemicals in the environment, and many factors related to how they work. There's the chemical itself, it's the route or method of exposure, and it's the persistence in the environment, as well as characteristics of the target organism that determines how dangerous the chemical actually is. I included this table from the previous edition of the book so that you can see some data on what the most toxic substances are. These are the top 20 toxic and hazardous substances. So number 1 you can see is arsenic, down to number 20, which is our 19 and 20 are different kinds of pesticides. This is the current table in your book, Factors in Environmental Toxicity. There are many sources of toxic and hazardous chemicals in the environment, and many factors related to how you get exposed. So we divide these into 3 different types of categories. Factors related to the toxic agent itself, factors related to how exposure occurs, and factors related to the organism itself. This figure also depicts how organisms can be exposed to these various types of toxins. You can get exposed from the air, you can get exposed directly from the source, you can get exposed through water, or also through soil and sediment that picks up the toxin and then gets into the organism. So this figure summarizes routes of exposure to toxic and environmental factors. So you can kind of take a look at these. Most of these look pretty straightforward. The other issue that is not so great for humans, but has an effect on many of our wild species, is the phenomenon of bioaccumulation and biomagnification. So cells have mechanisms for bioaccumulation, which is the selective absorption and storage of a great variety of molecules. This allows them to accumulate nutrients and essential minerals, but at the same time, they also may absorb and store more harmful substances through the same mechanisms. Toxins that are rather dilute in the environment can reach dangerous levels inside cells and tissues through the process of bioaccumulation. The effects of toxins also are magnified in the environment through food webs and food chains. Biomagnification occurs when the toxic burden of a large number of organisms at a lower trophic level is accumulated and concentrated by a predator at a higher level. This was the case in DDT, the example that you see here, where large raptors that ate many other foods at multiple trophic levels. They were rather high on the trophic level of the food chain. The DDT accumulated in these what we call apex predators or high-level predators. DDT caused eggshell thinning in the eggs of these birds, and so the eggs would be produced normally, but when the birds tried to incubate them, they would lose a lot of eggs due to cracking. So our raptor populations declined significantly. When DDT was discovered and the problem was discovered, it was banned, and in many situations these raptors have come back. The most commonly used and widely accepted toxicity test is to expose a population of laboratory animals to measured doses of a specific substance under controlled conditions. This procedure is expensive and time-consuming and often painful and debilitating to the animals being tested. It commonly takes hundreds or even thousands of animals and several years of hard work and hundreds of thousands of dollars to thoroughly test the effects of a toxin on very low doses. We're coming up with more humane methods using computer simulation models, cell cultures, and other substitutes for whole living animals. But right now, this is the only way we can actually, one of the only ways we can actually assess toxicity, and then develop policies from that. So this diagram, it's figure 815 in your book, predicts probable variations in sensitivity to a toxin within a population. Some members of a population may be very sensitive to a given toxin, while others are much less sensitive. So the majority of the population falls somewhere in between the two extremes. So when these tests are done, this is sort of how they do it. This is figure 816. Cumulative population response to increasing doses of a toxin is depicted here. The LD50 is the dose that is lethal to half the population. So these dose response curves are not always symmetrical, and it makes it difficult to compare the toxicity of unlike chemicals or different species of organisms. So a LD50 measure is sort of arrived at for particular toxins or regulated substance. So the LD50 is the dose to which 50% of the test population is sensitive. So this is basically looking at the case of the lethal dose. So that's where you get the LD50. We also have to look at different types of effects, acute effects and chronic effects. Most of the toxic effects we've discussed so far have been acute effects. That is, they're caused by a single exposure to a toxin and result in an immediate health crisis of some sort. Often the individual experiencing an acute reaction survives the immediate crisis and the effects are reversible. Chronic effects, on the other hand, are long-lasting and perhaps even permanent. A chronic effect can result from a single dose of a very toxic substance, or it can be the result of a continuous or repeated sublethal procedure. Unrelated species can react very differently to the same toxin, not only because body sizes vary, but also because of differences in physiology and metabolism. Hamsters, for instance, are nearly 5,000 times less sensitive to some dioxins than are guinea pigs. So that's why when these chemicals and the tests are being developed, they look at the relative sensitivity of the species that they're using for the test. Of the 226 chemicals found to be carcinogenic in either rats or mice, 95 cause cancer in one species but not the other. So these types of variations can make it difficult to estimate the risk for humans because we don't consider it ethical to perform controlled experiments in which we deliberately expose people to toxins. Even within a single species, there can be variations in responses. This can occur because different genetics, for example. A current controversy in determining the toxicity of bisphenol A, our BPA case study, concerns the type of rats used for toxicology studies. Standard toxicology protocols call for a sturdy strain of rat called the Sprague-Dawley rat. It turns out that these animals, which are bred to grow fast and breed prolifically under lab conditions, are thousands of times less sensitive to endocrine disruptors than ordinary rats. So industry reports that declare BPA to be harmless may be suspect because they're based on these Sprague Dawley rats that are not as sensitive. So you can kind of get a sense here of how this can get sort of difficult in terms of the scientific method and how we develop measures for this and how we develop policy from the studies. Nevertheless, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, regulates toxic and hazardous substances, and they have a system for doing so. They're called the pesticide labels and the MSDS sheets. So one area that environmental professionals will work in is in this area, either working for companies that have to comply with these regulations. So this is an example of a materials safety data sheet, and it has a number of sections on it, and I've just blown up one of the sections of it. So toxicity information is communicated on the MSDS sheet. It stands for Materials Safety Data Sheet. There are other terms that are used: safety data sheet or product safety data sheet. It's an important component of the product stewardship and occupational safety and health of institutions, businesses, and so on. It is intended to provide workers and emergency personnel with procedures for handling or working with that substance in a safe manner, and includes information such as physical data like melting point, boiling point, flash point, toxicity, health effects, first aid, reactivity, how to store it correctly, how to dispose of it correctly, what kind of protective equipment people should use, and also what to do about spills. Employers have to keep these MSDS sheets on file for any substances that they use that require these MSDS sheets. Proposition 65, the little warning down there that I showed you, passed into law by the voters of California in 1986, was created with the intent of improving public health through reductions in the incidence of cancer and adverse reproductive outcomes that might result from exposure to potentially hazardous chemicals. So Proposition 65 relies on a growing list of chemicals and substances believed to have the potential to cause cancer or other harmful reproductive effects in humans. Under this Act, a clear and reasonable warning must be given prior to a known and intentional exposure to a listed substance. The U.S. EPA also requires all pesticide products to be labeled, even products that you can purchase at your own local hardware or garden store. There's a limit of products that are allowed to be sold commercially to you and me. But there are a few. They have to be approved by EPA. The product has to have a label that describes toxicity and proper use of the chemical. Many other chemicals also have these labels, but they require a professional license to apply them. In fact, the EPA will state on there that it has to be applied by a professional. So you can get an idea of how some of these chemicals that you might be exposed to or you may use yourself are regulated. So this graph depicts 3 possible dose-response curves at low dosage. Some individuals respond even at 0 dose, indicating that some other factor must be involved. Response is linear down to the lowest possible dose, and a threshold must be passed before any response is seen. So now we're going to go on to a discussion of radiation. Gamma ray radiation is produced by subatomic particles, and these three types of radiation are the most damaging: gamma, X-rays, and ultraviolet. All these three are referred to as ionizing radiation, and it's wavelengths that are smaller and lower on the electromagnetic spectrum with sufficiently high energy to ionize atoms. So think about if you're getting exposed to these, if you ionize atoms in your body, you could cause various effects, including DNA damage. Radiation exposure is not as common, but it can, if there was a major disaster at nuclear power plants, there would be extremely serious effects. So I put some pictures on here of the Chernobyl plant, the 3 Mile Island plant. These were probably the two more famous nuclear accidents where there was some exposure to radiation. The other recent event that occurred was the Fukushima plant in Japan. So your book provides you with some perspective on radiation concerns. The other area of concern is UV radiation, and there's a discussion about the ozone layer. So this is an example of some good news. The ozone layer was gradually thinning due to the release of chlorofluorocarbons from aerosol cans in manufacturing. Those have been put under control, and the ozone layer problem is gradually being solved. This is an example of an environmental solution that required international cooperation. Since the adoption and strengthening of the Montreal Protocol that led to the reductions in emissions of chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, atmospheric concentrations of the most significant compounds that cause the ozone hole to thin has been decreasing, I mean. So the current estimates are that the recovery will not occur until around 2024, when ozone levels recovering to 1980 levels won't occur until about 2068. Other sources of toxins include water and air and noise sources. Your book covers this a little bit, but we are going to have chapters devoted to water and air pollution. So you can review the material in this chapter. The final area of risk that we talk about in this chapter is accidents and trauma. A number of factors influence how we perceive relative risks associated with different situations. And this is part of the issue with the some of the toxins. We probably have greater risks of in other areas like accidents than we do in some of these environmental toxin issues, although we need to remain vigilant. So risks are sometimes acceptable if they're associated with familiar activities, such as driving, or perception of enjoyment. So an example here, just to illustrate, we tend to have an irrational fear or distrust of certain technologies, like the nuclear power example. It's viewed as very risky, while coal-burning power plants are much more familiar, and we think they're relatively benign. But in fact, coal mining, shipping, and combustion cause an estimated 10,000 deaths each year in the United States. So this is a table depicting lifetime chances of dying in the United States. And you can see by the odds here what the estimate of risks are. These are statistical averages, and there clearly are differences where people live or how one behaves. But the average lifetime chance of dying in an automobile accident is 1 in 100. Still, compared to drinking water with the EPA limit of trichloroethylene, which is a toxin, is 1 in 10 million. So you can kind of get some perspective here on some of these hazards. So risk assessment is a method that organizes and analyzes data to determine relative risk. And risk management sets priorities and evaluates relevant factors to make regulatory decisions. As you can probably tell from the news, these are being debated all the time. So this cartoon I thought was kind of humorous, about reading ingredients while eating at the dinner table. So finally, policy decisions about hazardous and toxic materials also need to be based on information about how such materials affect the plants, animals, and other organisms that define and maintain our environment. So this table is relative risk to human welfare in terms of major problems. Some of them we're going to talk about in future chapters. In some cases, pollution can harm or destroy whole ecosystems with devastating effects on the life-supporting cycles in which we depend. In other cases, only the most sensitive species are threatened. So this table actually shows the Environmental Protection Agency's assessment of relative risk to human welfare. So this is the ending slide of this presentation. Determining what levels of environmental health risk are acceptable is difficult. We are exposed to many different health threats simultaneously. People consider some dangers as tolerable but dread others, especially those that are new, involuntary, or difficult to detect, or whose effects are unknown to science. The situation is complicated by the fact that news media give us a biased perspective on some hazards, while our personal experiences and our sense of our own abilities are often misleading. There are many steps that each of us can take to protect our health: eating a healthy diet, exercising regularly, drinking in moderation, driving prudently, practicing safe sex, and prudent measures to avoid certain toxic exposures are all important.